But what would it be like if we started to seriously study these to try and understand how we come up with our wayfaring proposals and understand how do we choose between them and what constitutes a good choice and what constitutes a bad choice. That's something, if God was giving me an option of bringing a discipline into existence, that's what I would like. I would like it if we started to think less and less about collecting propositions and more about wayfaring. And can we explicate our intuitions and can we dialogue about them in the sense of dialogos such that we can improve them the way we explicated our intuitions about inference and built up logic and other things like that.
Mr. John Vervaeke, welcome back to the Evolve Move Play podcast. I don't know how many times you've been on, so I don't feel like I need to introduce you too much. But it's always good to share a conversation. You and I have been talking pretty regularly, just one-on-one. But it's been a while since we sat down and did a recorded conversation.
Yeah.
So the kind of theme that I wanted to dive into is the idea of reading itself, or of literature as literature writ large, not just literary fiction, but literature writ large as a wisdom practice.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking a lot about how to manage the way that I interact with the written word.
Mm.
And I think that this is not just the written word, but let's say information streams, media streams, and how easy it is to do that in a very thoughtless way. It just, it's natural to us in our lives to be surrounded by the potential for information, whether it's YouTube or Instagram or social media or a specific genre of movies or books that you like to read. And we recognize, I think, that certain books have really powerful impacts on us, that they can be sources of wisdom for us. And yet I think that most people don't have any kind of structure or intentionality around how they're choosing what mediums they're engaging with and what sources within those mediums there are. And so that's kind of the conversation I wanted to dig into. I was thinking of it as something like maybe meta-modern canon formation. Right? Like there's an old idea of a canon, which is a way of thinking about how attention should be distributed. And then there's the postmodern critique of the canon. And then we're kind of lost in a place where there's no real structuring of hierarchies of attention. But maybe we actually need that. And simply returning to the traditional maybe actually isn't sufficient either. So we need to think deeply about how to develop our canon wisely. That's kind of the question I wanted to dig into with you. So how do you think about that in your own pursuit of wisdom and how you guide students?
Wow. That's a big question. I guess, where would I start? My doorway into this is around, I guess, an ancient concern that Plato has. I believe it's in the Phaedrus, where he worries about writing because he says it can't be questioned and answered. The irony, of course, is that he's writing something down in which questioning and answering is occurring, and it generally it's provoked at least 2,000 years or more of questioning and answering around the text. So, and I don't think Plato was stupid. I don't think he did. So I've always been like puzzled by that. I've been trying to think, what's he ultimately trying to get us to understand? And And part of my way of trying to appropriate that, I'm not claiming this is the correct interpretation of Plato. That would be devastatingly contentious. But what I do is I think about the concerns I have around propositional tyranny. And one way of interpreting, again, I'm being cautious about being exegetical here, but one way of interpreting Plato is that he doesn't want to lose the non propositional kinds of knowing because of the enshrinement or making sacred of written text, which tends to dramatically emphasize propositional knowing because that's all that's left in front of us, our statements carrying propositions. So for me, part of what I want to do is I want to look for authors that are alive and awake to remembering and recalling recalling us to the non-propositional kinds of knowing. And I also want to I try to set up a dialogical relationship between the various texts I'm reading. So I will always read multiple people at once around a topic and force them to argue in my head with each other. So I can bring in the dialogical element that Plato brought in by writing dialogues, and I can bring in his recommendation of to look for writers who are like him, writers who are writing but are nevertheless, as I said, alive and awake to the fact that we have to continually resist propositional tyranny and recall that most of the meaning making and wisdom cultivation is not taking place there. So that's an initial first response.
Yeah. So just reflecting back what I heard, I think it's interesting that in some sense your first reaction to the idea of a written canon is to question like the danger of being too invested in the written.
Yes.
The critique you're making reminds me of David Abrams' book, The Spell of the Sensuous, right?
Yep.
Where he essentially tracks a growing abstraction away from the sensual lived world in the way that we've related to the written word. And so you're saying one guide is to try to recognize writers who are not falling into the trap of treating the written word as definitive, and that are intentionally invoking or inviting us to recognize where the written word somehow fails. And then the second piece you brought up is this idea of I've heard it described as synoptic writing. Maybe I'm misquoting that idea, but that you essentially read different things to create a kind of parallax around an image or a specific subject that you're reading. Is that a good way of
Yeah, I think there's two sides of it. That's the synoptic, the dialogue, the dialogos between them that affords a synoptic integration that complexifies and gives something emergent is certainly how I have thought of that, and I'm not putting that aside. I want to add to it the more recent notion I've been developing since the philosophical Silk Road about the semiotic symbiosis, the way the sacred is actually always being drawn from various things coming together in an unexpected fashion and giving birth to new forms of life. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah.
And so I was I'm reading both for the synoptic integration, which is something I would take responsibility for, but I'm also reading in order to make myself available for that semiotic symbiosis to happen, kind of like what happens in the play Equus, or how you see like the genealogy of the God of the Bible taking place, things like that.
So just I'm going to try to unpack your language a little bit so that everyone can follow.
I'm sorry.
And no, don't be sorry. It's just you operate within a specific sort of like sphere of dialogue, and sometimes it needs to be unpacked. So semiotics is the study of symbols, and
Yeah, and I'm extending it to mean any kind of meaning system, the way other people did, like around Peirce's work and things like that. Yeah, so yeah, yeah.
then symbiosis is the we see symbiotic processes in nature when two organisms work together, right? Like
Yes.
a lichen and or a lichen is an algae and a fungus together. It's a
Yeah.
symbiotic organism. So unpack a little bit what a semiotic symbiosis is and how that kind of relates to the way that you engage with using multiple texts at one time.
So one of the things that came out of the philosophical Silk Road, and one of the ideas about how to enact pilgrimage in everyday life, was to try and afford this. So just to set that as the context. So the original meaning of theoria isn't theory. Older than that is contemplation. Then older than that is literally pilgrimage. And I think I've talked about this. And pilgrimage involves this kind of passage where you're moving, but you're also gathering together. But it's not a planned. It's not engineered. It grows together of its own accord. And so maybe if you give me a moment, a couple of examples. In the play Equus, I think we have one of the great portrayals of this in the teeth of the meaning crisis. And it's also deeply personal to me because I really identify with Dysart, the psychiatrist, in there. And what Dysart faces is he longs, Dysart as a man, longs to come into an encounter with sacredness. But he meets the boy who is done something quite violent and like shocking, and he needs treatment for mental health. But the thing that's happening in Alan the boy is you can see that various things from his unconscious and its environment and imagery, they're somehow being magnetized together, and a new god, Equus, is being born. And then Dysart is caught in this horrible, it's the tension of the play, which is in order to cure Alan, he has to kill Equus, but to kill Equus is to thwart him and throw him back, thwart his own quest and throw him back into the teeth of the meaning crisis. I take this as a parable for where we are. We're needing to orient to that. So what I'm going to say is perhaps religiously controversial, but it's not scholastically controversial. You can see the Canaanite high god El, and many of the Old Testament names are around, and he's a god of wisdom, and his palace is not in a place like everyone else. He's very other, he's very high, he's very wise, quite compassionate. And then you have YWHW. I won't say it in case you have Jewish listeners. I don't want to offend anybody unnecessarily. He seems to be a god of storm, and now there's increasing evidence of metallurgy, hence all the fire and volcanic imagery. And so this is, one god is very transcendent and about wisdom. The other is very, about transformation and battle, and they get merged together. And then you have the competition and then the assimilation of Baal, the storm god. You've got the subsumption of the female consort Asheroth and that god starts to take on more female characteristics. Then that god goes into exile with the Babylonian exile, and that gets they sort of crunch down to, well, who's to blame, them or him or us, basically, and they decided it was us, and that brings about this new kind of relationship. He becomes a universal judge, and that resonates with Ahura Mazda when the Persians take over, and all this cosmic imagery and the cosmic battle between good and evil, and that you return back. Eventually, they get conquered by the Greeks, and you get Philo, and you get that god meeting the Platonic good and going with the Platonic good. Platonism is running along, and it becomes Neoplatonism, where the one is the good, and that reintegrates in early Christianity with Augustine and Dionysius, and I can go on. And now the village atheist will use that as, see, this is all just historical contingency, and there's nothing to it. But that's because the village atheist and a lot of, I suppose, modern religious people have what I think is a very false view of religion. I don't even know if there is such a thing. What I mean by that is there's no pure pristine, permanent, self-enclosed religion. There isn't even a Christianity. There are multiple Christianities, then they bleed off into other things. And even within a church, you don't have a homogeneous population. So, all the stuff that the anthropology and religious studies and religious history has shown. Now, you can take that all as a grand refutation, and it does refute a particular model of religion, or you can take it as a liberation and saying, no, this is restoring us to a recognition that shows up independently in this great work of art, that is actually how the sacred disposes itself, that the sacred is constantly this synergistic syncretism, this complexification that produces ongoing emergence that puts us in a better orientation to connect and comport ourselves towards what is most real in terms of true, good, beautiful, meaningful. And that is what I'm proposing. So I try to read, not only to get a synoptic integration, which I think is important, all the cog sci stuff, but to make myself available, open to the possibility that things will come together in this more poetic fashion, in a way that is consonant with the way things are moving in my life and how I dimly sense them moving in the culture. I try to pick up intimations of that when I'm reading as well. Sorry, that was a bit of a thing, but
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think that's, in our other conversations, this is a theme that you've been working through and developing, and
yeah,
it's interesting because I went through like a phase of really trying to deeply be Christian, and I had a really intense conversion experience, and I attended the Orthodox Church regularly for over a year, and ultimately I somehow didn't stabilize as a Christian that I could recognize as Christian in the way that was happening in the Orthodox Church, and part of it was this historicity problem.
yep, yep,
Like when I listen to the critical biblical religious studies scholarship, it's quite compelling to me. It's hard not to see it there, and so there's two. I kind of have two models of what you're saying about it. One is, okay, you could say there was a view of the divine as El, as the highest principle of the divine, and then the whole pantheon, and then there's a view of the divine as YHWH.
yeah,
And then in some sense, they're synoptically merged, right?
yeah.
That's one way to see it, and then you could do the same thing with Baal and Ahura Mazda, and then the Neoplatonic one, and one
And Jesus
thing
of Nazareth too. I
Jesus
think
of Nazareth, yeah.
he's a magnet too of so many titles and transformation of those titles, and that somehow goes into God for like a large proportion of the population of the world, right?
Yeah. I've been doing healing journeys, very intentionally focused on healing with psychedelics in the last couple of years, and those have been really profound. And I've had some quite religious experiences and visions in that. And one thing that's been interesting is that there's this story about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says people talk all the time like they went out into the desert and they had a vision of God. And he's like, oh, I think that vision was real. It's not that you didn't see God. It's just that you saw this much, and the Bible is like the whole map, right? Is his view. But my question that came out of that was like, well, so I read. I think it's the book of is it the book of Ezekiel? I'm forgetting which book it is, but there's one book, one of the prophetic books in the Bible that reads remarkably like a journey on mushrooms.
That sounds like Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, there's these images of the angels, and I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of think I've been in a similar place.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I started to see that and say, well, I think it's certainly plausible to see this as a vision of something real, but it's also a vision that came through an individual human, right? Just so like I should have some humility about the reality of my personal capacity to see whatever I'm seeing as real. We can see this throughout all of these claims, and so then you start to think of or I started to think of these things as sort of like the 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 Bible is one profound source of many people's experience of perceiving the divine. And it is a map in that way, but it's not necessarily a complete map. And there's nothing in it that actually, to me, justifies the claim that it is the only map, or it is a 100% accurate map.
So this goes towards like a really central book around the cognitive science of religion. The cognitive science of religion, and I'm doing a lot of work on this right now, is shifting. The first generation was, why do the silly people believe in religious things? And that's largely fading under good empirical work and good theoretical argumentation. But Taves's book, Religious Experience Reconsidered, was really important because she did a move that I've made independently, and I immediately resonated with this. She tried to shift from a product theory to a process theory, which is, let's stop trying to give a definition of, sacredness. Right? Let's instead try and find the process by which people deem things sacred. And I've made similar arguments for insight and mindfulness and wisdom, because most importantly, relevance realization can't have a theory of relevance, right? So I was immediately drawn to this, and what I found intriguing there was the interesting mix of universal and specific, very much like what evolutionary theory does, or relevance realization theory. You have a universal process, but it actually predicts a continually heterogeneous set of products, if I want to put it that. And she talked about the two dimensions that seem to call people to want to make something memorable so they can recall it and relive it, is that it's anomalous and that it's salient. And this is, of course, a violation, a surprise in our predictive processing, our anticipation, and our surprise in our relevance realization. And to me, that really hit home to me. And I blame Plato for this. What a thing for a Platonist to say. I blame Plato for this, for getting us to understand the sacred as permanence, where what I was seeing in Taves' work and what I was seeing in a lot of other work is, no, the sacred has much more to do with innovation. It's like life. It is ongoingly innovative in the face of a reality that is relentlessly dynamic. And to be fair to me, this is a biblical metaphor, and it's a metaphor across traditions. I tend to emphasize the living aspect of the sacred as opposed to the permanent aspect of it.
Okay, so I think that ties in a little bit to the two sort of descriptions of what I see you trying to say with this history of the history of the conceptualization, or of the Western.
I would say realization, because I think here's where I'm going to be. If it involves predictive processing and relevance realization, it's a transjective process in which reality is playing a deeply important determinative role in the constitution of the experience. It's not just a Kantian conceptualization projected. The reason I'm saying this is a very famous thinker, John Hicks, actually argues this, and I'm rejecting that Kantian projection model.
So I think you're pointing at exactly what I'm trying to lay out here. So when I use the term synopsis, right?
Yeah.
What I'm thinking is that you could say that L and Ball and YH, WH, and the Neoplatonic one and Jesus of Nazareth, they're all a lens on something, but that thing is a thing in itself, right? So it's like the parable of the blind man and the elephant. Each of these people is seeing a real elephant, but we're seeing an elephant through them, but we're only seeing a part of that elephant. And so let me finish this thought.
Yeah, sure.
What I think I hear you saying is that that's one way of seeing it, but the other way of seeing it is that in the integration of each of these figures, we are, in some sense, co-evolving an elephant that is distinct.
Yeah, and it's the second one I would put emphasis on. Thad Emanuel, who wrote Circling the Elephant, points out there's various things that are frequently forgotten in the presupposition. First of all, that parable does not convey relativism, because all the parts of the elephant fit together. They are not incommensurable, isolated worlds unto themselves with their own personal truths. That's not what the parable is showing. Secondly, they can all talk to each other and they can all move through the same space. So there is a presupposition of universal processes that stitch them together so that the parable can be told. So you also have to ask yourself, where are you standing in order to tell the parable? And so if you do that, if you say, yeah, there are these universal processes that we participate in, that we are not sort of the authors of, and the environment and the world, reality, whichever scope of analysis you want to put to it, is also participating, then I do prefer the co-evolve language that you used. In fact, I think if you push on the first, it turns into the second, if you're really following the analysis carefully.
I think it comes down to that idea of process versus permanence, though, right?
Yes.
Is the divine something like an unmoved mover that is kind of the stable and absolute through history, or is the divine something like a dynamical engine of potential change for human beings that we access through these images that that arrive through history in many mysterious ways, let's say.
And the reason why it was important to do all of this, to return to the original point, I think the notion of something being canonical is actually oriented around both the notions of synoptic and sacred. That's how you get a canon. The canon is supposed to be the best synoptic integration that keeps us in track of the sacred. But if your notions of synopsis and your notions of sacred are a certain way, that's going to really constrain how you think of what a canon should be like. And if we're arguing for a different, what I would call a counter-modern, not a postmodern, but a counter-modern proposal of sacredness and synoptic integration, process over product and things like that, then that is going to give us different recommendations for what we should consider to be canonical.
I think that's a good bridge to one of the key ideas that I wanted to explore with you, which is I've been thinking about what I should read through the analogy of how I think about how I should engage in physical practices.
That's a good analogy.
So there's an infinite set of things to read, effectively. Maybe not infinite, but it's infinite as far as my lifetime is concerned.
It's combinatorially explosive.
Combinatorially explosive, yeah. Okay. So I can't read everything. It's impossible. So I have to, if I want to be a wise person through what I read, I have to think about a hierarchy of how I read things. And I was articulating this some years ago about, I think some physical practices have an asymmetrical potential to donate to other physical practices, and therefore you need to engage in those primarily, or they have a higher degree of relevance to the environment. They're better attuned to solving solutions in life.
Broader, deeper transfer, things like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you gave me the terminology of it's a small world network.
Yes, for example.
And so I've been trying to describe this to people, and I was thinking about so the idea is if you want to train to be a movement generalist, you don't know what kind of movement demands you're necessarily going to be under. So you need to basically be at a place where you can easily move to the place that you need to be. And so the analogy I was giving some students is it's like if you might need to fly anywhere in the world at any moment, you would want to be in one of the largest airport hubs that's most geographically well situated. So maybe Anchorage, Alaska, or Dallas, Fort Worth, Paris, right? You want to be there. You don't want to be in Bellingham. And so then you could think about there's a set of those hubs that are available to you within movement, right? So my argument is that parkour is one of those hubs. Like MMA is one of those hubs. Like a basic team field ball sport like rugby is one of those hubs. Some kind of dance is one of those hubs.
Yeah.
Now, as I've started to think about like how if so like you like I end up just being completely bowled over by Jordan Peterson at some point, and the way that he's thinking about the world is just kind of knocking me over. It's like, well, if you read Jordan Peterson deeply, you discover that a lot of what Jordan is talking about is Nietzsche
Yes.
and Jung and J.J. Gibson and Jean Piaget and Jaak Panksepp. So then if I go over and I discover that Rob Gray in the motor learning space is also talking about J.J. Gibson, and John Vervaeke in the cognitive science space is also talking about J.J. Gibson, it's like, well, maybe I need to go to J.J. Gibson,
Yep.
right? And so you start to see that there's these asymmetrical points of donation. Now, I think the idea of the canon is that these things are sort of perennially true, right? That the canon at any given time should be the canon forever. But like I was thinking about the analogy of Jordan, right? Jordan Peterson, if you think about it like a mimetic node in the space of how people are perceiving the world, Jordan was essentially a nobody in 2016. And then he developed this extraordinary cultural potency. And I always told people, like, even if you don't like what he has to say, you kind of need to read him or listen to him a little bit, because there's something happening in the culture that he's informative to. And maybe it's the recovery of Nietzsche and the recovery of Jung and the integration with this. And maybe you can read through Jordan and end up finding those things, and those things will be more valuable to you. But why is it happening right now? And so you can imagine that that rather than one canon, there's these like dynamical networks of like, airports that suddenly become highly salient, like you imagine what's happening right now in Iran, like all of a sudden to move troops, there are critical points that are now central nodes in the network of behavior. And if you actually want to understand what's going on, you shouldn't be listening to pundits. You should be trying to get facts about how troops and shipping and insurance are moving around the world, and what are those central generators of knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about this. Like, well, how do I? First of all, there are perennially important things. If you are part of the West and you want to understand the Western tradition, you kind of have to understand the Bible, and you kind of have to understand Plato.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And then maybe you need to understand Aristotle, and you need to understand Descartes, and like we need to grab those nodes, but we also have to be aware that there's a kind of that the nodes actually grow and collapse. They're not actually static in a way. And I think that's the dynamic that you are trying to pull out and point to and say, if you want to recover that idea of the hierarchy of the small world network, you have to do it in a way that respects it. It's actually dynamical.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you get trapped in certain ways.
That's exactly right. So, think about getting trapped in Euclidean geometry, and then how, Einstein needs, what is it? Is it Reichman? I can't remember the alternative geometry that he used, which was developed for independent reasons. And before Einstein, it's just sort of sitting out there. And then after Einstein, it becomes central in important ways. And, scientists now regularly and reliably talk about multiple dimensions beyond three, as if that's the way they always spoke, which of course is ridiculous. That was a huge revolution in thought. Thomas Kuhn. So yes, totally. I think it's the case that our significance landscape, the way we try to get our salience landscape to track. So I'm doing a lot on the phenomenology of realness as a way of understanding sacredness. And one of it is the idea of, like Gibson's notion of a texture gradient, there are intelligibility gradients. And because all of realness is actually a judgment, often a metanoetic judgment of, oh, from here I can explain that, but from there I can't. It's to find those asymmetries, like you're saying, but I don't think that they are laid out higgledy-piggledy. I think they form a valley that has a valence, to play on some words, that we can follow, and so our salience landscape is constantly having to reconfigure in order to stay in a kind of continuous close contact to the topography of the intelligibility landscape, if I could put it that way. Because I don't think of reality as fundamentally static. I think of it as fundamentally in flow, not flux, flow. There's a difference between those. And so I think we should expect that things that were once prominent could fall into the background or fall off the table. And I think that's important. It's this is an attempt to resist the two things that I think could go very wrong in setting up a canon, and this will be familiar to you. One is to be caught up with a nostalgia, which is like, these are the things we always have to hold on to, and we always have to get back when we start to deviate from that. And the other is a utopianism, which is, no, 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 no. Everything has to be thrown off because we have the method, the universal method, which will allow us to steal fire from heaven and become the gods themselves. And both of those, I think, are what I'm trying to resist. I'm trying to find a middle path between them, where we want to say, it's not going to be static, but neither can we engineer it into existence.
So you're pointing to the idea of the return is often misleading.
Yes.
And for some reason, okay, I want to come back to that. I'm just going to bookmark it because I want to lay these three options out. The second is I'm almost thinking about like the Chinese idea of the rectification of the names.
Yes.
Right? Like things are always drifting. Things are always in flow. And then the connectedness, the capacity to be properly connected can break down. And so there's maybe three reactions to that. One reaction is to then say, okay, we have to go to the previous state, which we think represented actual deep connection to the real.
That's right.
So that's your pull of nostalgia. Like, let's avoid that. The second one I would say is to see that if the hierarchies don't work in the way that we thought they worked, that there should be no hierarchy at all. We just throw it all out.
Yeah. And we become the authors of our fate.
Yeah. And then the third is to say, and then that's where it then becomes, we will determine it. We will engineer it.
Yeah.
I was reading a book called The Origins of Sex, A History of the First Sexual Revolution by Farmers Davawailo, and it basically claims, and I don't completely agree with this necessarily, but it says that there's a pretty consistent history of a general agreement that sexuality is something that it is the responsibility of the commons to police. Mm-hmm. And that individual sexual behavior is a communal concern. And that idea starts to break down at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And interestingly, it's the policing is initially greatly increased by the Reformation, but then it's the ideas of religious freedom and personal consciousness that come out of the Reformation that then get applied to sexuality.
Yes.
And one of the really interesting pieces within that is how much a lot of the questions of the traditional monogamous sexuality are actually then derived from sola scriptura, but that's not how people in the Old Testament behaved. Why should I not have wives and whores and concubines?
Yes.
If the biblical fathers were able to have them? And I found that super interesting. I have a family history that goes back to Mormonism, and to realize Mormonism didn't create that, just
No
context. It arose from a general question that was happening throughout Protestantism about polygamy. And And I find that people are still stuck with these questions, and they're still fighting about whether that's something that we just determine, we just decide what society should be like. And we'll, I think a lot of sort of the polyamory perspective is we can just engineer
Yeah.
out sexual envy and resentment.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
And but it's like people have actually been trying that for like 300 years.
Yes.
And then, then another reaction is like, well, at some point, monogamy seemed to be doing pretty well. Let's just go reclaim that model.
Yeah, and that can be a kind of heavy-handed patriarchy kind of thing that comes rolling back in, and that's also far from avoiding foolishness and affording flourishing. Yeah, I think your case study is perfectly apropos. It's an excellent choice, Rafe. I think it really calls exactly. So there's ways in which the world, as the large world in the statistical sense, the world that is always beyond whatever formalization we bring to bear to solve our problems. The world that is radically uncertain because it has real emergence in it, real creativity, radically novel for the same reasons, radically ambiguous because it's not here for us, all that kind of stuff. That world is always playing a part in our sexuality because of forces of biology and evolution, and I mean also cultural evolution. The cultures are not static entities, and neither are they homogeneous. All that sort of stuff, all that reification stuff has to be put aside. So there's a sense in which we can't simply engineer it because there are forces beyond our ken and beyond our control, and also not because just they're bigger than us, but because we participate in them. They constitute us, and trying to engineer them is like this is Nietzsche's thing, that we're trying to jump over our own shadows, and we can't do that. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that some way people had of acknowledging the large world is the correct small world we should stay in. Because the point is, what the 2024 paper is basically arguing is you will have an unending stream of small worlds because there is no way to a priori engineer a small world that will give you the equivalency of the large world. I mean, there's no way to get relevance realization out of the system and replace it with either a nostalgic machine or a progressive machine. That's just not going to happen. That's my deep argument. It goes down to the guts and the grammar of biology, and the precision principle, not in predictive processing, but the precision principle that Roy and other people are talking about in biology. It's like it's the same machinery as relevance realization. The idea of the deep continuity is now becoming something like more like a scientific claim that the machinery of relevance realization, the machinery of biology, deep continuity, and that grammar is something we can't get away from. It is always a primordial presupposition, but it is a universal process, not a universal product. That's the key, I would say.
Yeah. I want to try to repeat some of those ideas back to you in my own words to see if I can make it more digestible, hopefully, for for folks outside of the
Please do,
thing.
please do,
And
please
to
do.
make sure that I understood it.
I don't want to give anybody epistemic constipation.
So so you point to nostalgia as one pole and utopian engineering as the other pole.
Yep.
And you called these small worlds that are in some sense trying to give us a map to the big world.
The real world, yeah.
The real world. And so you're saying that, and then you contrast that with a commitment to relevance realization.
Which would be, in the analogy, the irremovable skill of map making.
Yes, yeah. That's actually exactly the analogy I was working for myself, which is to say that people are looking for a map, and what they need is skillfulness in mapping.
Yes, exactly.
But okay. But I think that part of skillfulness in mapping is absorbing maps.
It is, but it's also, if by absorbing you also absorb how you should set up Well, a synoptic integration between maps in which things that you don't foresee can emerge between them because of the way they mutually correct and challenge each other and intimate things that are not in any map that you currently have, which is exactly back to what we were proposing. Oh, I was proposing at least
Yeah.
about how to try and organize a canon. Yes.
Yeah. So I, I read I read that book, The Origins of Sex, at the same time that I read D.H. Lawrence's book, The Rainbow. Have you ever read The Rainbow or any of D.H. Lawrence?
I've read D.H. Lawrence. What did I, Sons, was it Sons and Lover?
Sons and Lovers. He
Yeah.
wrote Women in Love, Sons and Lovers, and Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was quite interesting because it's sort of 100 years after the primary subject material of The Origins of Sex, but it's really a book about the sexual revolution. Essentially, it tracks 3 generations of a family, and it sort of tells the story of 3 characters or 3 primary protagonists, and then it really, the kind of critical moment that it concentrates in on in each of their lives is their sexual awakening and their pair
Right.
bonding.
Yeah.
And then the final character goes through her sexual awakening. She makes love to a man, and she decides that she doesn't want to marry him, and she breaks off her engagement, and that's the end of the book. And so it's sort of getting at this change, and D.H. Lawrence believed that in some sense, D.H. Lawrence was really reflecting what you reflected at the beginning of this, which is the problem of the written word and the tyranny of proposition.
Yes.
So Lawrence believed that that we had become too abstracted, and that what he wanted to do in his writing was to recover embodiment and to, in some sense, to, I think, help people let go of the shame of sexuality that was part of the Christian model they inherited.
The original sin model.
Yeah. And so that created the little synopsis of seeing these things in these different times.
All right.
Yeah. And then of course for me, I suppose that I've been wrestling a lot with my own autobiography and with the psychedelic healing and the stuff that I've been through. And it's like, what, in raising children. And I think that I was talking to our friend Chloe Valdery about this, about like, a lot of the things that like my mom is reacting to or other people are reacting to, they're not actually the culture that I personally grew up in, right? Like I grew up post civil rights among people who were the people who supported the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I grew up post women's movement among people who were the people who supported the women's movement. I grew up post sexual revolution among the people who were pro sexual revolution. And there were shadows to those revolutions that wounded me pretty deeply. And so as I've entered adulthood, my tendency has been to critique the excesses of those movements, right? DEI and the reification of race is the most important thing, even though it doesn't even exist, right? And the rejection of the difference between men and women. The denial of difference has been extremely frustrating for me because I think that because in my upbringing I didn't have a lot of women around, and the women who I had around, or a lot of girls, and the women who I had around were quite wounded. That made it hard for me to really accept their perspective. And then I also think because I experienced sexual abuse by a man, it was very hard for me to enter any kind of empathic mental frame for what it's like to be androphilic, to experience attraction to a man. To imagine what it is like to be sexually attracted to a man was immensely psychologically threatening to me.
Right.
Which created this huge theory of mind problem in interacting with women and wanting to invoke that attraction to myself, right? And so as I entered into, a relationship and a marriage, my default was to just sort of treat my spouse as if she was one of my male friends. and it failed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I also absorbed a sort of egalitarian ethos of marriage, which I think it really mattered, and it really tried to solve some very important things, and yet somehow it often seems to fail to invoke real coordination. And so I've been struggling with that my entire adult life, to say like, okay, but yes, we don't want to oppress women. And that's probably a lot more, that hasn't been maybe salient enough to me in the way that I think about the world, how much that's actually a central problem.
Yes.
How do we escape the the fact that men essentially have a physical ability to force women to give them what they want, that has been abused across many, many cultures across time. It is a like a game theory central problem of human dynamics. So women, one thing that's really interesting about that book by The Origins of Sex is how he writes about the theory that the medieval mind, as far as the written mind, believed that women were the more lustful sex, and that they were an inherent danger to men by bringing them into the body and bringing them into lust. And then we completely change as we enter the post-Reformation, the Enlightenment, and into the Victorian period, where now female chastity is something that's seen as totally natural, right? Women are passive and don't have sex at all, have a sexual drive at all. And the what was really striking was how much that was women. It was because women started being able to write for themselves. And what did they want to write about? They wanted to write about how dangerous men were to them,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how much it was a lie that they were the predominant engine of, you know, of, let's say, sexual malfeasance.
Right. Right.
And of course, in a culture that's sex negative, it makes sense to be like, no, 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 you guys are the problem.
Right. Right.
And so it was just very interesting to read through that history and recognize how much the change in technology created the grounds for women to now advocate for themselves. And what they were saying was like really real. Women were being seduced and abandoned, and
Yeah.
ending up penniless, and ending up being punished by society, and ended up dying. So I guess I got a little passionate there.
Well,
But
you were doing something important though. You were bringing up about how you were addressing a danger. One of my mottos is from Spinoza: God does not have abstract ideas, which is right. It's easy to maintain fables of pristine purity when we talk in abstractions, but when we bring it into human problem solving and suffering, that starts to be called into question. So I thought what you did was actually very valuable.
thank you. Yeah. Reading that book, reading the Bible, reading through some of these things has really given me a very different sensitivity to what feminism is a reaction to. And then there's this deep reaction to me, which is like, okay, but I inherited feminism and it really didn't help me figure out how to be a husband.
Right, right.
And so there, those two poles are something that we're still struggling with, that we're still trying to figure out. And this was part of my quest to sort of understand a canon, because one of the things that's always been really interesting to me, or that I've struggled with since I started to try and adopt Christianity, was where are our models
Yeah.
of virtuous husbands, virtuous marriages? Christ is not married.
Yeah.
Socrates, we don't, the stories about his wife are, I think they're
Apocryphal.
most,
Yeah.
yeah, they're mostly like later. They're probably not very representative of any real dynamic, but there's nothing there to grasp onto and say like, okay, this is how a wise man lives
Totally. Yeah.
in Plato and Aristotle, and like we just go down the list. The
Don't
Buddha,
go to Aristotle. That's what I can say that for sure. You don't go to Aristotle for how to be a good husband.
like
Yeah.
over and over again, like our models of wisdom fail that test. And so like
And
one thing I've been asking is like, where in the canon is it, right? And that's I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT said read D.H. Lawrence, so that's why I read The Rainbow. Um, and so I'm I think that one of that I think it's possible, and this could definitely just be my own bias, but I have some reasons to think this. But I think that the inability of men and women to understand each other and to love each other and to see through difference in a positive way is actually at the center of why our society is going crazy. We see this because we are the most polarized around sex politically, not around the issue of sex itself, but around the sexes
yeah,
that we've ever been. Right? Women, women, I think up until the 1970s were more conservative on average than men, and then since the 1970s, women have been somewhat more progressive or on the left than men. But over the last, I think, 15 years or so, that gap just went absolutely, crazy. Among it just ran away. And then the Democratic Party has largely been captured by this far left side that's predominantly believed in by women. And what's funny is that initially then the accusation was that young men are going right, but if you opinion polled them, their opinions hadn't really changed since the 1980s, 1990s. It was just that the center of gravity in total had moved to the
yeah,
left and they were farther relative to it. But over the
yeah.
last five
I've seen
years,
that argument made well. Yes, I
yeah.
agree.
But over the last 5 years, we're now seeing a reciprocal polarization of males to a very far right perspective. And
And that was
certainly,
that was modeled in the two parties because in the previous decades, they had gone through reciprocal rounds of increasing purges, where they were purging out moderates and people who were willing to cross the floor and all that sort of stuff. Yes.
and so I actually think that the only way that we're going to heal the political polarization is actually starting by trying to heal the male and female relationships in our personal lives. We
That's
have
an
to be able
interesting
to
one.
talk to people, our mothers, our brothers, our daughters, etc., in order to find synopsis again between the sexes about the way the world is. We're occupying completely alternate realities, and those alternate realities are increasingly driving us crazy.
So that brings up, well, there's two things. One is I would want to explore the hypothesis because it's a really provocative one. But that might be my want and not what your viewers would want.
Hey guys, so sorry to interrupt the conversation. I just wanted to give you a message from our only sponsor, which is ourselves at Evolve Move Play. So if you want to support what we're doing, if you want to get involved, we have a free online community now. It's at coaching.evolvemoveplay.com. You can sign up and share deeper conversations about all of our practices there with other practitioners, other folks who are curious about what we do. We also have our online courses available through there, and you can get involved and start building your own practice so you can go into the deeps of this kind of wisdom generation practice for yourself. So please check out coaching.evolvemoveplay.com. We look forward to seeing you over there.
What this seems, tell me if this lands. It seems that there's two issues that came up here. One is technology can unexpectedly make available cultural states that were previously unavailable to us. And so you get the notion of meta stability as opposed to static stability.
Yeah.
That, to me, then does provide an ontological backing for my argument about trying to see the sacred as something that pilgrimages us through those metastabilities rather than a place that we're supposed to stick to or arrive at or return back to. Because, to make it concrete again, you've pointed out that the many of the sacred texts don't give us much help about this problem. I point out to you, they give us very little help about social media. They
Yeah.
give us very little help about what the hell to do about AI.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, if God or the sacred is now silent in front of these things, I'm kind of saying it is becoming, then the sacred is the kind of entity that becomes obsolete, which strikes me as the opposite of what should be at the core of our notion of sacredness. The sacredness should be a fount of intelligibility. It should be a field that gives birth to new life continuously. And so I think we are looking for, this is what I mean by the advent of the sacred. I think we are looking for that what will magnetize things together, and the magnetism is happening because people are crossing disciplinary boundaries and talking to each other in the way they wouldn't have been doing 15 years ago. And like what is going to emerge, because I put it to you that the problem that you're pointing to is, right, people need a higher order, a shared normativity,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can trust each other to share and mutually shape meaning together. And those are all bound up together. And you can't put them together like Lego. They're autopoetic. Each piece is deeply dependent on the other ones. And the only place I've been able to see in history where you get, right, this irreducible complexity, to use that somewhat jaundiced term, the irreducible complexity between normativity, trust, and shared meaning is the sacred. And so, one way I don't know if I'm turning it around on you, but I would say if what is adventing claiming to be the sacred doesn't give us the way in which we can heal these rifts between, let's say, men and women, but also between, adults and children, and other ways in which we are divided. I don't think we should consider it sacred anymore. I mean, that's where I'm getting. That's where I'm getting most radical, and I might sound like a progressive there, but I'm not. I'm trying. I'm trying to say, right? If it doesn't, if it's not orienting us to reality and transforming us to truth such that we can solve some of our deepest problems with some of our most virtuous wisdom, that it's not doing the job of the sacred. That's how I want to put it.
Yeah. There's so much there. I want to pick apart. I wanted to laugh though at the like not being a progressive, because I I think I'm quite, on many dimensions, if you were to try to pinpoint me, you'd probably call me a conservative. But I personally, I think that the moment that we commit ourselves to one of those ideas, we
Yeah.
tend to make ourselves more easily deludable. So
And manipulatable. Yes. Yeah.
even
Yeah.
though you could map me and say, okay, in a heat map, that's where you tend to occupy, I don't want to then make that an identity.
Yep. I
But
agree.
in my questioning of Christianity, I have found myself questioning it on effectively progressive grounds. And so I've thought about like, am I conservative within progressivism to some degree? And I think that in some sense, what you're describing as central to you is a progressive idea, but there's a conflation that we have to un, unwind between progressive as the idea that the new is inherently good and better.
Yes.
That's utopia
Yeah.
versus relevance realization is processual. It's always ongoing. Therefore, you have to be changing in order to be where the thing is.
Yeah.
Does that
I
make sense?
agree. It does. Here's my concern. So I don't disagree with anything you've said, but we're talking about, the concepts and the names that we're bringing to bear, and that matters. I agree. It was a big mistake by Spencer to understand evolution as a progression,
Yeah.
and that launched a lot of evil on the world. And
Okay.
that's my concern. That's my
Okay.
concern.
Yeah, I understand that, and I also think that the rejection of teleology and evolution may be mistaken, right?
And that's a
Because
scientific question that I'm open to. I mean,
yeah,
one of my colleagues is Dennis Walsh, and but that's not. That doesn't mean that our favorite teleologies or our particular
yeah.
human centric narratives are what's going on either. I
So
don't
there's
think
that.
evolution is going to show that things progressed to us. I
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
for me, just to be clear about this ontologically, see, one of the things that makes evolution non computational is the large world as the large world plays an irremovable causal historical role. If the asteroid didn't hit, we're not here. And
Yes.
the asteroid, right, stuff like that, right? And that's now, do I see evolution being able to complexify across time because complexification better tracks the complexity of the environment, and therefore there may be something like that kind of teleology in place? Yes, but that's not a teleology that allows you to propose the utopia we're moving towards.
Yeah, I think that's a really rich way of looking at it, which is to say, and it comes back to this like fundamental problem of modernism, postmodernism, whatever comes after postmodernism, right? You have the naive story of progress, and then you have the rejection of the grand narrative, and then you have something like a need to return to the potential for grand narratives, but with far greater epistemic humility.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so we can
That's
say,
that's why I'm proposing pilgrimage as an alternative to narrative. If you wanted to put my recent work in a sentence, it would be that.
interesting. It's parkour.
But yeah, no doubt, no doubt.
Yeah. I also think of something like a dance, right? Like a really good dance, an improvised dance. It has a structure, it has constraints, and it has a sort of infinity potential within it, and it 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 has a telos, and yet also you need to maybe treat the telos gently.
Well, this is Kars's distinction between are you playing an infinite game or a finite game?
Yeah.
And I think life. This is. I mean, I got to know James a bit before he died, and this is clearly James' view. I think of life and religion. The religious case against belief, I think, is good evidence of that. That religion and life are infinite games, not finite games. And I think both standard progressivism, utopianism, and nostalgia are to understand them as finite games. That what we can do is find the final fixed rules that will always apply. I don't see evolution, biological evolution, giving any evidence of that. This is one of my, like, things survive because they become more simple. They survive, they hard, oh, soft, fast, no, like because the large world, qua large world, is a maybe even unequal, dominant partner, but at least a partner in how life modifies itself. We can't stand aside from that, and pronounce one way or the other. This is why I'm getting increasingly attracted. I'm preparing for a course on Zen Neoplatonism for the lectern, but I keep dipping into Pyro, because there's now increasing evidence that he did in fact go to India and did interact with Buddhists and brought back Buddhism and came up with a how would you be a Buddhist within the Greek philosophical milieu, and that's what Pyro is, and the isothenia and the balancing of arguments, not because you're trying to become a Humean skeptic, but because you're trying to become as adaptive as possible. So I don't know if Pyro would object to this. I imagine there's academic scholars who would, but I see Pyro as saying replace belief with opponent processing. That the isothenia is, both of these arguments have merit and have them in an ongoing opponent processing, because if you try to resolve this, you will actually lose a grip on reality. And so I think that's, if I were to put that into, right, the mix of what we're saying here, the synoptic integration and the semiotic symbiosis require us to engage in ongoing dialogical the ecology of practices model.
Yeah. I want to return for a second to the analogy or the sort of like thought laboratory of marriage and sexual relationships.
Sure.
Because we can
I,
you know
I, I, I laugh about this because I've failed more than succeeded in this domain. Although I think with Sarah I am going to, this is the person I'm going to be with for the rest of my life. But it's taken a long time and a lot of failures, and many of them were vicious on my part. And so I appreciate the analogy, and it's definitely a humbling one for me because yeah.
yeah. Well, I think our culture has been struggling with it, and I think every culture struggles with it. If you go back to those debates that were happening in the 18th century, there's this question of does God says we're supposed to do it this way, right? So that's one model of how we justify an approach.
Yep.
And then increasingly it became, is it natural? And you still hear this. People, that book that had such a huge impact was, Sex at Dawn. Humans are not naturally monogamous. Book was, tendentious, but that at some point I'm like, well, if you read the anthropological literature, what you'll see is that human beings mostly exist in homosocial pair bonds. Most people are bonded to one person at a time, most of the time. Those bonds are serial. Mm-hmm. Most people don't make it through life with just one partner. There's often low levels of polygyny. There's a fair amount of extra pair partnering outside of it. And this is also not just human beings. It's lots of monogamous species, or seemingly monogamous species.
Yeah.
But those dynamics are often couched in really brutal terms. So yeah, there's, people are engaged in sex outside marriage, sex outside their pair bonds, and they're killing each other over it. They're beating their partners over it. They're killing children that they think are not theirs.
Yep.
Like this idea of partible inheritance, being proof of like the goodness of polyamory. Like if a child has too many purported fathers, the likelihood of their infanticide goes way up.
Yep. I know.
And so people are like, okay, what's natural? I'm like, well, maybe what's natural is not the highest expression of the good of what our natures are capable of. And so we could say that the pair bonding is natural. And there's a way to do it that works better in general. And that the reason why a super restrictive system existed, like in the 16th century in England, also had like real communal things. Like this is a really funny thing about that is that the pressure to prevent fornication and adultery in the lower classes came from the fact that they actually had a very strong social welfare network. And wealthy landowners didn't want to have to pay taxes that would support orphans.
Right, right.
So it's like, well, you have trade-offs. If you want everyone to be invested in caring for all of the children, then you have to control the behavior that generates the children.
Yes, yes.
And it's not that these systems are inherently good or bad. They're all trade-offs, and they in some sense brutalize us one way or the other. Right? This is, I think, one of Jordan Peterson's great insights is like the society is always both protecting us and making the grounds by which we can engage with each other, and also like brutally repressing us.
Yeah, I would point out. I mean, this is again sort of central to my overall theoretical framework. I think that the only way to be optimal in the face of trade-offs is opponent processing.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. That's exactly where I wanted to pick up and kind of got lost, which is the idea of let's say traditional monogamy in the West is one model, right? And people can see, hey, things are breaking down. The trade-offs don't look like they're working out for people. We have to go back and just completely reassert that model, not recognizing that that model actually had a lot of negative trade-offs as well.
Yeah,
And
always.
yeah, and was optimized for a world that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Yes.
One of the things that I think is really interesting is, so the single parent single earner family, middle class family, that was like a 30-year experiment in American
Yeah.
history. Like it
Very
basically,
rare, very rare, very rare. And it's only largely because of the asymmetry that was gifted to the United States after the Second World War.
yeah. And so we think we're going back to this traditional model that's not even traditional at all. But if you, like, I haven't read a ton of, like, the feminine mystique and all the stuff that came out of the women's movement. I have a sort of gestalt of it, of like women feeling deeply lonely without community and with their husbands away, and with this very scripted model of how men and women were supposed to react, and saying like, hey, this is not giving me space to be a human being of myself, and it's not satisfying.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, actually, I think that they had a point. I think that that's like a really, really valuable understanding. And like my wife, she's working from home and living with our kids, and she's afraid of like not going out into the world enough to have her own identity and her own connections. And it's not dumb. It's not ideology. It's
No.
just a recognition that she has real human needs that are not satisfied by me and my identity and our children and their identity.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
So one of the things that's interesting to me is that if you go back before that, you had the corporate family model. You married someone not just because you fell in love. You married them because they were going to be an economic partner.
Yeah.
You did a certain kind of work that needed a certain kind of support as a man. And you found a woman who was in the right trade, in the right family, who would then know how to do the other part of what your work was.
Yep.
And I get very like leery of some of the sort of neurobunk theories of human behavior, where it's like we're just going to label everything vasopressin and dopamine and whatever. And I think we don't know how often that's true. But one idea I've seen proposed, which was interesting to me, is this idea that vasopressin is stimulated by shared work, and that's a central bonding mechanism for human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we're now losing. And whether it's vasopressin, or we can just say shared work is a bonding mechanism for human beings. And so if you're spending a lot of time.
It's philia.
Philia.
It's the love born out of reciprocity, because we love something together, like the philia of Sophia. That gives you philosophy. Yes.
Okay, so I'm kind of like throwing a whole essay at you that I've been composing in my head and losing the central point, which was, let's say there was the Christian, monogamous, patriarchal, even post-World War II idealization that became reified for the American right as the way it was supposed to be. And that's rejected by the American left. And then the replacement is egalitarian, hedonistic, freedom, sex positivity, let's say. And neither model is really working for people in a lot of ways. Like it's hilarious to see how many trad wife influencers end up having the most egregiously hedonistic and corrupted lives behind the scenes.
Yeah, I agree. So again, I think an opponent processing in which both sides, parties, are committed to a sense of the shared sacred beyond either one of their perspectives, and that ensures that they recognize that they will always have to be recalibrating in order to make a space for the voice of the sacred to be heard. That's exactly the model I'm trying to propose.
Yeah, and that was what I was trying to get back to, is the sense of if we have these two models and we know that neither truly functions, what I think you're proposing is we have to kind of move beyond just a model towards being able to map the territory ourselves. We
Yep.
do need principles. We need access points. We need ways of educating ourselves into it. But we have to recognize that the models themselves are, in some sense, insufficient to the territory they're trying to cover.
Yeah, I think yeah, I sort of I'm trying to integrate the cognitive phenomena of flow with the epistemological notion of fallibilism, and we get sort of a flowing fallibilism this in this way, and we recognize that we're much more reasonable when we're dialogical than when we're monological, and zero sum games are pretty much inaccurate for most of reality. Most of reality is in trade off relationships. I find it paradoxical, or no, ironic. Ironic is the right word, that Thomas Sowell actually defined a conservative as someone who relentlessly recognizes trade off relationships, and that you always have to make careful, deliberate decisions about where you want to go with. Like, if we do this, we're going to have this as the trade-off. Do we want to do, and how that, and I was talking with James Matthew Wilson and D.C. Schindler. I think I recommended the book to you, The Vision of the Soul on the True, the Good, and the Beautiful by James Matthew Wilson, and in which he makes the very strong argument that conservatism is not what now passes for conservatism. It's about trying to conserve the Christian Platonic tradition, and it turns out to be strongly convergent with a lot of the stuff we're actually feeling our way towards here right now. I'm saying that because I can hear the both demons, right? I can hear the left screaming about, but you're not worrying enough about oppression, and then I can hear the right screaming at we with, no, we once had it much better than it is now, and it's like I'm not clear on either one of those. It depends on your measures, right? It really depends on your measures, and like, are we better off? In some ways we are, in some ways we aren't. That's where I mean. The irony for me is that it's a self-defined conservative who keeps making that claim that no, you got to pay attention to trade-off relationships, and you got to pay attention to what you're measuring and why you consider that the best measure or the single measure. This is a problem where, like, I mean, to give an analogy, don't pay attention to single metrics of the economy. The stock market's doing great. Who cares? The stock market can be doing really great, and on a whole bunch of other measures, maybe joblessness is going up tremendous. Like, single measures are ridiculous. Yeah. And this is, again, I don't like static, small world, right, permanent, because the measures there have to be multiple measures, and the measures are going to multiply across time. And what we keep doing is remember when ChatGPT came out and I said, these people are trying to give a univariate measure of a multivariate phenomena, and human beings are reliably shit at this, and so all of these predictions about when we'll have genuine AGI are going to turn out to be false, and they were, right? And this is what we keep trying to do. We keep wanting to make, right? We keep want to make something that is almost always nonlinear, multivariate, and dynamical into a linear univariate. And I think that is just one of our most fundamental biases taking control of us. I think both the utopian and the nostalgic, right, say there's a line and it's univariate and it's linear, and because of that I can see where we need to go. And I just, nope.
So I think my sort of like slogan for this is, I think that people prefer off-the-shelf worldviews.
That's too bad.
I mean, you're familiar with the cognitive miser hypothesis, right?
Yeah, Kahneman's hypothesis.
Yeah. But what we see, what I notice repeatedly is that someone will adopt a low resolution map of reality. They will see that it fails them in some important way, feel betrayed, and then move to some other equally low resolution version of
Yep.
reality that then they will be just as committed to. And I've done it myself, right? I was a very strong left leaning liberal, anti-war, super pro environment. And then something happened during the Obama administration. I completely went the other way, and now I'm reading Red Pill and Manosphere stuff, and just completely tanking my marriage. And, so I'm not free of this sin, but I slowly was able to sort of start to try to piece together something that was a little bit more tailor-made. And now that's kind of one of the questions that I'm getting at with this idea of the canon is like, how do
Yep.
we actually get to doing that? So, and now I know many people who were vegans who then went straight to the carnivore diet.
Yeah. I know that's a weird thing in our culture, and somebody should do some research on that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I've been at some point, a friend of mine asked what were the most important books that had influenced my understanding of like physical culture and stuff. And I realized that I just didn't have that many books, that actually most of what had influenced me was blogs and then social media trends and things like that. And so I started to think like, well, I clearly seem to be very articulate. I understand things that a lot of people don't understand. I'm doing okay, but is that actually the right thing? Should I like be reading more books? And I started to read more books, and it's taken me a long time. And eventually I started to recognize that it took me a lot more effort to sit and read a book than it had before I had social media. When I met my wife when I was 21, she was at UC Santa Cruz. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and to entertain myself, I went to the library stacks and got like 50 books out of the library that were highly technical books about things like hybridization in mammals and falcons. And that was fun for me. And then now I have a household full of books that are great, and I'll have nothing to do, and I'll be like, I need to relax, and I just automatically want to look at my phone.
Yeah.
So I've been fighting this for years, but last summer I took a sabbatical from EMP, and one of my commitments was I was going to really, really invest myself in books. So I started to read. I had read the Bible over the previous year, and I was like, okay, well that was really rough. That was hard to read it front to back, but now I've kind of built some reading stamina, so I'm going to take on, I can't remember what the order was at that point, but at some point I started to read Demons by Dostoevsky, which I found absolutely miserable to read, but has been one of the most important things that I've read.
The Underground Man did that
Yeah.
for me. Notes from Underground.
Yeah, Notes of the Underground. Yeah. I read War and Peace. I read, A Tale of Two Cities. I read The Republic. I read J.J. Gibson's Ecological Approach to Psychology, and I just set aside like 15 minutes a day to read the most difficult things that I was reading, and then I'd read history or literature that I liked at the end of the day before I went to bed. And a few things happened as I really was able to carve that. One was I was happier.
Yeah.
I was less reactive to whatever was happening right now politically. So I would see the latest controversy come up on social media, and I would think, I want to say something about that. I have an opinion. And I'd be like, no, I'm not going to say anything for a week. I'm just going to make sure that I'm coming from the right place before I say anything. So I'll just go read these books instead. And then a week would pass, and there'd already be a new controversy. And I'd be like, well, clearly that wasn't important to post about. And so I went through that cycle, and eventually I started to really, really start to feel how much all of my online information ecologies were polluted with bullshit.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about reading as an intentional practice of building my capacity to sustain long form attention as
Excellent.
opposed to short form attention.
Yeah.
It's also perspective taking. When I
Yeah.
read reading Demons, which is basically this extraordinary, it's so prescient about what happens in Russia. It's really extraordinary to read it and realize how long before the Bolshevik Revolution this was and how exactly he dialed what the revolution would be like.
Yeah.
And it's like, those are revolutionary energies. We are experiencing those revolutionary energies right now. So I read that. I read A Tale of Two Cities, which is about the power of those revolutionary energies in France and what drove them, or what their justification was, let's say. And then War and Peace, which is really a meditation on fatalism in some sense in history. It's like, at a certain point, these gears are moving and there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to try to be a good person in it.
Yeah, the fact, I mean, you get that in that you get this titanic genius, Napoleon, and he's still going to be defeated. Right?
He's going to be defeated, and he's not even in control of what's happening.
No.
Things are driving him more than he's driving things at some point.
Yeah.
And then I read Plato's Republic, and Constitutions and Characters absolutely blew me away. Like, reading his description of why democracy fails and what its end states are and how it gives way to tyranny. It's like 2,400 years ago. It's as if he's writing about what's happening right now.
That's become a heuristic for me. I look for people, Spinoza's like this too, that are prescient about things that I can be clear of, and then I give them the benefit of the doubt they may be prescient of things that I have not foreseen, and that's why I pick them up frequently because of that. Yeah, Plato's. Yeah, that blew me around when I read the Republic. Many things about the Republic just blew me away in that way.
Yeah. So that talk about like synoptic reading and sort of like generating this, engine of wisdom cultivation. Those works together really worked for me. And then I was also reading J.J. Gibson at the same time. So I was getting this. J.J. Gibson, I think, is an extraordinary corrective to what the Republic gets wrong.
Of course. I think, this is for me, William Desmond. I'll reiterate my prediction that William Desmond is going to be considered one of the great philosophers of this era, 50 years from now, for sure. Because he one way of putting it is he puts Merleau-Ponty, J.J. Gibson, and Plato back together again, and does it really, really brilliantly. My first talk with him is out, and the remaining ones will be coming soon.
I will have to check that out.
One personal moment around that, I hold him in very high regard. He then told me that he thought my work was very important, and that I was right, that his notion of the metaxu, of the between, was the ontological grounding for my theory of relevance realization. So when he went into it, he said, yeah, you're right about that, John. You're right about that.
Excellent. It's always nice to get those kind of recognitions. I'm trying to connect all the threads here.
Well, let me try. I want to put something to you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if these are the right metaphors, but so take them with a light touch. You have the top-down synoptic integration. I see that happening, but I think there's a semiotic symbiosis going on, bottom up. Your intuition is drawing you, and things are speaking to each other and calling to you other stuff, and there's something emerging out of that complexification that's bottom up to the top down, synoptic integration. Yeah.
I mean, at the same time that I've been doing this project of reading, I'm also integrating this history of the psychedelic work, and then obviously all of the embodied practice that I've done. So when I come to Gibson from a very different point than many other people, because I've thought so deeply and experienced so deeply and gone so deeply into physical practice. So,
yes.
And in the same way, like, I reject the abstractedness or the inwardness of the Platonic vision in a different way, because I have this deep grounding in practice. So it gives me a different engine.
And you have allies within the Platonic tradition. You have Iamblichus, and you have Erigena, and you have lots of allies. That's another heuristic I look for when we're talking about traditions as opposed to people. How alive is a pattern of self-correction in that tradition? I also look for that, and I you know, I've said a few of them. The Platonic, Neoplatonic tradition, I have criticisms of it, but it seems to have a kind of vital self-corrective ability to it. Perhaps because it's one of its founding figures is Socrates, um, and I, this is an opportunity for the legacy religions to, what is their capacity for self-correction in the face of these emerging ontologies, and the emerging problems that those emerging ontologies give us. Um, and I haven't been too impressed with the legacy religions on all of these accounts so far. Um, there's a lot about the legacy religions that I find extremely beautiful. Like you, I have an attraction towards Eastern Orthodoxy because it seems to me to capture a lot of what I think was right about Christianity. But I haven't seen anything that, like, I have to be careful because there's specific individuals that I hold very dear within that tradition. But I haven't seen anything from the tradition as a whole that speaks towards some of these issues we're talking about. Well, that's why I did the Philosophical Silk Road. I don't think any of the traditions on their own can do it. I think, to use an old slogan, I think we have to come together or we're going to fall apart.
Yeah, I think that there's I'm very, given my background, I'm very skeptical of sort of hippie perennialism where everything is.
I'm not a perennialist.
I know you're not, but that's the let's call that a failure mode of
Yeah.
a syncretic approach.
Yes, it is. But it is the failure mode of saying, well, there's two types of perennialism. One is a product perennialism. I guess prototypical would be Huxley, although he's been treated a little bit unfairly by popular culture. But, and then there's process perennialism, but by people like Studstill and others, in which, again, there are universal processes at work when people are trying to orient to ultimate reality. And they can provide us a normative ground for comparison, and they can also provide a dialogical ground for connection between disparate ecologies. And then there's product perennialism that says all the traditions are ultimately saying the same thing. I think that's just historically false. I think that's an indefensible position.
I don't think even any one of the traditions is necessarily saying the same thing.
Well, that's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem. I don't think they're, like I said, I'm trying to switch away from talking about religion to talking about people being religious, which I think is a real phenomena. I don't think there is a Christianity or a Hinduism or a Buddhism. Like, the differences between Zen and Pure Land are very significant. The differences between American Baptist Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy are deep and profound. And the idea that either one of these is pristinely the same as the original church is a ridiculous claim on both parts, by the way.
Yes.
And so, again, we have to have a notion of the sacred that takes seriously history, anthropology, religious studies, interreligious studies, and comparative theology. That I gave an argument for that actually a few weeks ago at UTism in cognitive science, because I was basically saying cognitive science is not studying religion, and yet religion is a big part of what it is to be a human being and a cognitive agent. And then when it has done it, it's basically used a horribly moribund notion of religion from the Enlightenment, rather than paying attention to religious studies, anthropology, interreligious stuff. And I said we should pay attention to that and then bring that into our attempts to understand the religious dimensions of human cognition. And I was surprised at how well that was received. I had one person came up to me and he said, I'd always thought of religion as kind of like a neurological defect. And then he said, "But you made a really good case for something there. I gotta go back. I gotta think about this." And that, and
My friend Paul Vanderklee talks about the receding tide of secularism.
well, yeah, I think Paul's right about that. I think Jonathan, if we're going to speak about friends, I think Jonathan, in some of his moments, talks about the death and resurrection of Christianity. I don't think the I've said this before. The science of the future is theology, but it's not the theology we have now. And I don't think if Christianity comes through what we're going through now, and I'd like to talk to Jordan Hall about this because this is where he's on the edge of my thinking around this too. I don't think it's the Christianity we have now. And that sounds shocking. Your Christianity now is not the Christianity of the 3rd century or the 4th century. Like, stop. Like, we've got to stop pretending that we have the pristine, untouched signal that we have that is pure, and like we have to stop that. I now think of that as egregious as like the single faculty that should be deified or demonized in order to bring us happiness, or the single practice. There is no, free lunch theorem. There's no panacea practice. There is no single faculty. There is no pristine signal. Stop. Right? Doesn't mean there isn't sacredness. Doesn't mean there isn't ultimate reality. Doesn't mean that people can't undergo fundamental transformation. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot that we need to practice and live from and exact from these great wisdom traditions. In fact, it means all of those things.
Yeah, I was sitting with Beth, my wife, after just kind of on the end of a psychedelic trip, and I was noticing that I had wondered if this sacred would occur to me, that I would be like struggling with the idea of God in it. And I was like, oh, I wasn't, right? And I was talking to her about the fact that like I felt like I kind of tried to drink too much of of religion and solve it for myself.
Yeah.
And ultimately I came to this place of like, I'm really okay with the idea that when I die, I'm just gone. Like, it doesn't bother me.
I view that as a gift.
Yeah.
I view that as a gift. I mean, I think Tolkien was onto something. I don't know if he would really stand by it, but Iluvatar's gift to, yeah. And I'm reading a really good book. I forget the author's name. I apologize because I promised to try and promote the book more. But is How Non-Being Haunts Being. And the proposal that death is a gift. Death is not something being stolen from us. It is something being given to us in a very profound way.
I mean, there were multiple reasons why I ended up not being able to sort of stabilize into Christianity. One of them was the feminist critique of Christianity and the patriarchalness of the Bible. The other was it was very parochial. It's a book about the Jews, which is fine, but it's hard to identify myself into it. And another was the historical problem of like these things don't agree and they're not attested in a way that makes it secure for me epistemically.
Yes.
But the biggest one in a lot of ways was actually that I came to realize that I didn't understand, I couldn't comprehend for myself what the promise of salvation was and that I would want it. The idea that I would be saved for eternal life as a kind of angelic thing that is not like a fleshy thing, and wouldn't be married because I was a being of spirit, was incomprehensible to me. I can't comprehend myself as the type of thing that would still be myself on the other side of that transformation. And I find it quite terrifying, actually. And so I did another psychedelic trip, and I was talking to God, and I was like, look, if you need me to keep going in some way after I'm dead, I trust you because you came to me and you showed me that I was loved and you changed me such that I could be the husband my wife needed and the father that my children needed. That change really happened through religious conversion, and I will be forever grateful for it. So if there's some eternal persistence of me is necessary for you, I will trust that you will make that good. But I don't, it is not a promise that I need for myself. And
Yeah.
I want to live this life. I don't want to be worried about that. I want to be changed so that I can be the best for the people that I am with now.
Yeah, I'm perhaps harsher than you. Um, I think the quest for immortality is the thing that most blinds us. This is Spinoza, that most
Yeah.
blinds us to eternity. And I think that's a perennial message coming out of a lot of going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hmm.
But I think, I mean, I'm being very influenced by all the work done by Marshall Davis, somebody I want to talk to on his proposal. It's interesting, once somebody starts making an exegetical framework and you start looking through it, you start to see a lot of things you didn't see before. He's making the proposal that the kingdom of God is ultimately about non-duality, and that you can see this, and that eternity is not about immortality, but about stepping outside of all of the dichotomies that condemn us in a really powerful way. And it's the least I could say of it is, I think it is it is a reliably defensible interpretation. The problem is the Gospels are underdetermined, contrary to all of the attempts at orthodoxy. The fact that we can't get an orthodoxy, maybe we should consider maybe we should consider that
Yeah.
we have underdetermination, right? We don't have enough to reliably settle on a final solution, and I'll always use that provocatively. And maybe that's actually, again, how the sacred disposes itself. Maybe that's why the world, this is where Schellenberg matters. Maybe, the fact that we can't reliably solve the theism-atheism debate is evidence for the spiritual ambiguity of reality. Like I'm very want to make those kinds of meta moves, and
Let's live in the ambiguity. So we're running low on time, I think, for both of us here. I wanted to try
yeah,
to pull the
I gotta
thread
go.
a little bit.
Yep, I'll be quiet now. Just you go ahead.
Sorry. I wanted to pull these threads a little bit. I think you proposed a lot of interesting ideas for how we can think about what is the process that we're looking for in. Ultimately, I think the idea of the canon is as a tool for wisdom cultivation.
Yeah,
So you're problematizing that and pushing back and offering many different lenses for how we access that. And we've been playing with this problem of, and the small world, big world problem. So the canon itself is an idea of how do we create a model that someone can start looking at wisdom through via literature. And I think your pushback is something like, that's probably less about specific works and more about a way of approaching literature itself. And then maybe the works become more obvious through that. I think that's probably true, but I also think that you also need to read the Bible and Plato.
well, I
No.
mean, if you're in the West,
Yeah. Is
and
anyone not in the West anymore on some level?
I don't know, but then that's a symmetrical argument. Then you
Oh,
should
yeah, I
also read
agree.
the Tao Te Ching and the
For sure.
Dhammapada, right? Yeah.
No, I agree with that. I don't think that we, like, the entire history of the last 200 years of philosophy, so many of the people that we're talking about, and even before that, what are they responding to? They're responding to pluralism and
Yeah.
encountering Vedanta and encountering Taoism and encountering all these ideas. So I that is on my. I haven't got there. I've read the Tao Te Ching, but I haven't read the Pali Canon or some of the other things. But that is on my list.
And one further note, one note and then one proposal. The one note is you have to do the corresponding practices to read the text properly. Like if you want to understand the Bible, you got to go to church. If you want to understand the Tao Te Ching, you've got to practice Tai Chi Chuan, I Chuan. If you want to understand the Dhammapada, you got to try some deep Vipassana. Like you have to do the texts and the practices mutually need each other, and they can't get along without each other. Then I want to propose. This is the academic side of me. So there's a Greek word hodos or hodos. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Hodos. It means way. It's the original Christians were called the followers of the way, and of course Taoism is about the way, and Buddhism is the way. The way keeps coming up, and I think we need something like hodosology, the study of ways, as opposed to the study of doctrines or belief systems, which I would love to try and found as an academic discipline. But the problem was it wouldn't be like any normal academic discipline. It would be very much like Rafe, everything we've always been talking about, an entire ecology of practices, dialogical, imaginal, mindfulness and embodied stuff going on. But what would it be like if we started to seriously study these to try and understand how we come up with our wayfaring proposals and understand how do we choose between them and what constitutes a good choice and what constitutes a bad choice. That's something if God was giving me an option of bringing a discipline into existence, that's what I would like. I would like it if we started to think less and less about collecting propositions and more about wayfaring, and what can we explicate our intuitions, and can we dialogue about them in the sense of dialogos, such that we can improve them the way we explicated our intuitions about inference and built up logic and other things like that.
I can imagine a extensive lecture and course and set of practices and maybe retreats, wayfaring towards wisdom.
Yeah.
Could be fun.
That's actually a good title, Wayfaring Towards Wisdom. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's leave it there, John. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
This has been great. This has been generative for me, which is always a mark that getting a little bit closer to the truth.
Thank you.